listening to Talking Law, the podcast where business owners just like you discover how to avoid legal landmines and build value using smart legal tips. Join your host, Joanna Oakey, as she cuts through the legal jargon and gives you clear and simple, actionable legal strategies, which will get you optimal business results.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here, and welcome back to Talking Law, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, in this episode, we speak to our very own Mark Gardiner, all about what business owners and their teams should be looking out for when managing suppliers and supply contracts in a downturn. We drill into a few risk factors and warning signs to look out for in this area, how to deal with customers with signs of insolvency, and much, much more. These are all critical things to understand right now. Volatile times often expose new and enhanced risks that you should be preparing for. The sooner the better, right? So without further ado, here's our discussion with Mark. Mark, huge welcome to you on the show today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you, Mark. Now, such an important topic, topical obviously right now, how to manage a business in a downturn. Obviously, so topical at the moment because we see a lot of concern in the business market right at the moment, and a lot of signs of distress in businesses. So I think this is super critical for business owners to be aware of, not just from their own business perspective, but to be aware of what might be happening to customers and suppliers as well.
That's right. We're really in some uncertain times.
We absolutely are. Absolutely. And I guess just giving it an overview, what are some of the key areas that you think businesses should be thinking about in preparing themselves for this more difficult environment that we're heading into?
Yeah, look, I think a business owner needs to really think about what happens in a downturn and how it might impact their business, and to think about things like how will our customers behave? How will our competitors react? What are our strengths? What are our challenges? Are there opportunities here? And are there any things that we should be concerned about with suppliers? And so how do we look at all this going forward? It's like, well, I guess a manager needs from time to time to try to step back from the day-to-day and just spend a little bit of time thinking about managing in an economic environment that most managers haven't seen. We had our last recession in the early 90s, so close to 30 years ago, and people haven't had to deal with any of these issues.
Such a good point. It really is a good point. And so I guess starting with that thought process, how will customers behave? What should businesses be looking out for? What are some of the risk factors? What are some of the warning signs?
The key warning sign is payment. Are your customers starting to pay late? Are they starting to reduce their order quantities? Are they starting to slow down their normal business cycle? And then can be some subtler changes. Is there a high staff turnover happening in their business? Are you dealing with new people all the time? Are you dealing with fewer people on a customer side? And it's just a matter of being aware that the customer may be experiencing some distress.
And one of the things that I find we often see with businesses customers that might be suffering distress for our clients, their customers, is identifying part payments of invoices, payments in round numbers, that there's sort of a little bit of a red flag that there's things going on. They're trying to manage cash flow in the business tightly, but not being able to meet payments as they're due. And so what are some of the things that our clients then can be thinking about doing if they identify some customers where they feel there might be some risk as to, future stability, solvency?
I think the first and foremost is to understand your exposure and how important is this customer to you, and start to think long and hard about whether or not you want to continue to supply the customer. As a starting point. So do I make a situation worse by staying in there and helping out the customer? Or do I cut my losses and say, well, I have to I have to stop supplying. And that can be a really difficult conversation to have, and one that I think most business owners would try to avoid. But, I think the key is to not expose your own business to the failings of a customer. And then I think you need to look at, the contractual relationship that you have with the customer. Now, what is your security for payment? Are there guarantees in place? And do you have, for example, a PPSR registration?
Such a good point that you make, Mark. I think now is the perfect time for businesses to be assessing, what clients they have on credit, whether those credit terms that they're providing are appropriate on an individual and on a group basis, right now. So they might want to bring in their credit terms either across the board or for individual clients, and whether or not they're utilising properly some of these other opportunities such as the personal property securities register. Absolutely. Because I find actually there's so many SMEs who just aren't on top of that, maybe have heard a bit about it, but just don't have any of their clients registered. That's
right. And I think typically PPSR sort of contract terms are complicated. And they're complicated because they're essentially a term of art. Lawyers have put them together to try to protect everybody. And if a customer or a supplier, for example, reading a PPSR set of terms, I think the eyes glaze over by about the second paragraph.
I think so. I think you're right.
Sometimes mine do as well, I have to say.
Well, I wasn't going to put my hand up and say the same thing, but yes.
Yeah, that's right. But essentially, by registering a security on the register, it moves a person from being an unsecured creditor to a secured creditor. So it improves the position in the event of a liquidation of a customer. So that's important. It really is important. So, but perhaps there's even a more fundamental step, and that's to make sure you have a contract in place, that the contracts haven't expired, that the terms are still binding and appropriate. There hasn't been a change in the company that you're dealing with and you've still got a contract with the old company. Those kind of fundamentals, business health checks, which so often get overlooked because you're busy. But in matter, again, that stepping back, assessing the position and working out where do we stand with our customers, with our suppliers, with our staff, and how do we manage this uncertain period?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one other point, is that even though you have been paid by your customers, doesn't mean that there's not a risk that could be clawed back. Maybe talk our listeners through how that could potentially work, Mark.
Okay. Perhaps I'll start with an example just to frighten our listeners. So imagine that you've been dealing with a customer. You're aware that they're struggling financially. You've extended your terms a couple of times. You've had some conversations with them, but they've paid you late, perhaps underpaid you, but then sadly they go into liquidation. And you think that's really sad, but you're relieved because at least you got paid. And then you get a letter from a liquidator which says you have received an unfair preference and all that money you've received from this customer you have to give to the liquidator. That's generally not a good day.
No, absolutely. I just want to add to this, this happens all the time, so don't think that this is, something that wouldn't happen to you. It is a regular event. It happens all the time.
It's what's called a relating back period. So payments that are made within 6 months of a liquidation are subject to examination by a liquidator to determine if the party that receives the payment has received what's called an unfair preference. Because what a liquidator is doing is a liquidator's job, among other things, is to try to make it fair for all the creditors of a company that's gone into liquidation. And so if one company has been paid and others not, the law says, well, that can be an unfair preference. So the money goes back into the pool by the liquidator and is used to try to treat all of the creditors equally. Now, that's good if you haven't been paid and you might get some cents in the dollar. It's really bad if you have been paid and have to give it back. And as a supplier to the customer, if you have reasonable grounds for suspecting that the customer is in financial distress, that would mean that it would be an unfair preference claim that would be made successfully against you. So if you've had discussions with a customer about their payment issues, that can be of itself enough to have you put on notice that the customer is in financial distress, and you could be subject to an unfair preference claim from a liquidator.
And I think it's such good, timely information that we're passing out here. It's such good reminders, because there's two components, I think, Mark, of what you're talking about here. First is the way that you manage your discussions in relation to your customers might be having difficulties in payment. So we'll talk about that in a moment. The second is in dealing with any communication you get from a liquidator where there is an attempt at a clawback for a preferential payment. So on the second point, I think the very first thing to say is don't just pay the money back. Come and get legal advice quickly, because there's a way to deal with it. And so I think that's the marker, absolutely, to run and get legal advice very quickly.
Can I add a second point there? Don't ignore the letter. Don't ignore the letter. I've seen that happen, and then you get many months down the track. The money that has been received from the customer has long gone. And suddenly you're looking at having to repay an amount of money. But as you say, getting legal advice is absolutely critical. There are defences to an unfair preference claim. They can be quite technical, and they can involve quite some lengthy analysis of the facts and circumstances around the supply arrangements and the payments. So getting legal advice is really important.
Yeah. And getting legal advice earlier in the piece might be the real key here, though, Mark. Absolutely.
And hence, don't ignore the letter.
Yeah. No, but I mean even before that, Mark, even when,
oh, yes.
If your customer, if you become aware of your customer having difficulties in payment of invoices, I think at that point just makes sense to, give your legal team a call and make sure you understand anything that you should be aware of in how you're conducting those discussions about payment.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And it also puts you on notice as well that there could be an issue if this client is really in trouble, that you may have a claim. So you may not want to spend all that money you've received.
Yeah, don't spend all the money you've received. I like it, Mark. That's clever. That's our last tip. Don't spend all the money.
Don't spend all the money.
Love it.
That's right.
What else? Are there any sort of other pointers for the businesses should be thinking for about managing a downturn?
I think I said initially, how will our customers behave? So we're talking about that. How will our suppliers behave? So are there issues with supply? Are the suppliers that you've got shortening their credit terms, making life more difficult? So, just think about that in terms of your business operations. And look at your contracts as well. What happens if your supplier becomes insolvent? What options do you have? Where else could you go for the key components of what you're selling if your suppliers aren't there? So, always give that some thought.
I love that. Build in, a backup A, backup B, backup C as well, and I think if COVID showed us anything, it was, it showed us an exposure to supply chain that perhaps had just not been so apparent beforehand, so.
That's right. I think we'd all just assumed that, globalization was here to stay and was unshakable. And you place an order and it comes no matter what. And, from places we knew not where. And then we realized that, sometimes, key components come from overseas and, the ship's not there or the containers aren't available and suddenly everyone's got delays.
Yeah, or the manufacturing plants have all shut down for a while. But anyway, he's hoping that doesn't happen.
That as well. That's right. That as well. Yeah.
And so we've talked about your relationships with your customers. We've talked about your relationships with your suppliers. Are there any other business areas, I guess, that we should be thinking about?
I think there's a general sort of business management focus that can come into play at this time, and that is to look at your own business operations. So, examine your product or service lines. Which are the profitable ones? Where should the focus be? What are your costs of doing business in each of your divisions, perhaps? If we're anticipating that business might downturn, what's the cash collection process you have in place? What's your cash position? What's your cash flow forecasting? And do you need to start looking at cost control now? Because the time to look at cost control is when you start to anticipate a downturn, not after your finance guys walked into your office and said, we're running out of cash.
And then we got to go give some money back to that customer that we've had a preferential payment club.
And then things like, are your staffing levels appropriate? Are you overstaffed in some areas which you kind of known about for some time, but everything's fine, so you don't need to? Now might be time to look at getting your headcount right and right sizing your how you go about it. And then, of course, particularly these days with people working from home so much, is your office the right size? Do you need such a large floor plan? Can you look at sharing options? Can you sublease? Can you license some space? Can you share space with somebody else? Think about cost controls before you need to. It would be probably my number one rule of business.
Love it. And I guess the other area as well is then to take the opportunity to look at your employees and your leave balances.
Leave is really important. I've seen a number of clients who've come to me and said, I've got an enormous amount of staff leave building up. What can we do about it? Because it's not so much a cash flow issue, but it's certainly a liability issue on the balance sheet. Staff leave accruals just add up. You should consider whether or not you should try to get that leave accrual balance down and encouraging staff to take leave. Most modern awards allow a direction from an employer to an employee to take leave. And if you're not covered by modern award, you might be covered by an enterprise agreement, which has a similar provision, or maybe your employment agreements do as well. You should look toward the requirements of that, and that is you can direct staff to take leave so long as their leave balance doesn't fall below 6 weeks. They're allowed to have up to 6 weeks leave accrued. And you can direct a leave to be taken if you give between 8 and 12 weeks notice. So think generally about pushing down that accrual. And then also look at your shutdown. Making sure that you appropriately staff through a shutdown period. We're coming up, it seems, very quickly toward Christmas. What staff do you need on deck between that Christmas New Year period and early January when it's traditionally quieter? Can you get that staff leave balance down at that point?
Such a good point, because, we have many clients that we work with who are moving into exit, and it can be shocking for them at the point of exit to suddenly realise they've got this whole bank of liability sitting in their books, and, that has to be dealt with at sale, whether it's adjusting to the purchaser or paying out the staff. But it has to be dealt with.
I think it comes as a real surprise to business owners that their sale price of the business is going to be impacted because their staff haven't taken leave. And I know, Joe, your focus on assisting businesses to exit. The key is to think about the exit a long time before you want to exit. And managing staff leave is just one of those things that's so easy to overlook. It's so easy to overlook because it just sits there. The accounting team may say the balance is getting a bit high, and you go, yeah, okay, but it's not really costing me any money. It's just sitting there. It's one of those paper liabilities, it's not really there until you want to sell, and then suddenly it's coming out of your pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Or, you have a number of staff leaving, and at that point, it's something that you have to pay out then. So anyway, managing.
And then it becomes a cash hit.
Yeah, then it becomes a cash hit.
Then it becomes a cash hit. Yeah, that's right.
Well, look, Mark, I just wanted to say a huge thank you for coming on to the show today. Obviously, there's so many things that you've talked about that are just great advice for businesses. But of course, it's also about having, a wise person to turn to with a steady head who can help you navigate that course. And look, thank you so much for giving us that well of information that I think, as I said before, such a timely reminder for us to be looking at what we can all do from a business perspective, in a downturn or anticipating that we may be entering one.
Pleasure, Joe. I'm glad I share this wealth of information that I've accumulated over far too many years.
Great work. Thanks, Mark. Well, that's it for this episode of Talking Law. We hope you found this episode useful and insightful. And if you'd like more information about this topic, then head over to our website at talkinglaw.com.au, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this episode, as well as any contact details and additional information that we refer to. And if you'd like to get in contact with our guest today and the services they offer, you can go ahead and check out our show notes for those details. And of course, if you're interested to talk to any of our lawyers about anything relating to this topic, then just head over to our website at www.aspectlegal.com.au, where you can book immediately a free 15-minute discussion with our legal eagles at any time that works for you. Of course, there's also a booking form in our show notes as well. And if you haven't yet, then please consider subscribing to Talking Law on your favourite podcast player to get a notification straight to your phone whenever a new episode is out. We'd also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and rating if you're a subscriber or even if you're listening to this podcast for the very first time. Well, that's it. Thanks again for listening in. This has been Joanna Oakey and Talking Law, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. I am so very excited to announce that I've hit a non-podcast related milestone and released a book. You might wonder why? Simple. I wanted to help business owners understand the mechanics of deal making and the interaction between three critical phases of business: acquisition, growth, and exit. And so I am very happy to announce Buy, Grow, Exit, a guidebook for business owners and their advisors on how to buy, grow, and guess what? Exit in a way that maximizes value and avoids landmines along the way. The book is available now, so just head over to buygrowexit.com.au to get your copy and to access a whole heap of free resources that will really help you on your journey of acquisition, growth, and exit in your business or in working with your clients. Also, check out our show notes where we will link straight through to that page.
Thanks for listening to Talking Law. Tune in next time for more smart legal tips and tricks to keep you clear of those legal landmines. If you want to get a download of today's show notes, head over to talkinglaw.com.au. Information in this podcast is general in nature, not legal advice. If you want advice for your business, visit talkinglaw.com.au.